So do we want to bother with this jokey intro or just start talking?
I mean,
I, it, this one seems a little forced. Maybe we just start talking.
we could just start talking. Actually, it sounds like I'm talking about an intro to a furry, but really, I'm talking about an intro to, yeah. I tried to segue and I failed.
Hi, I am the Gneech.
And I am InkBlitz.
Hey, and this week we are talking about races in D&D
And why
specifically.
the traditional races are boring.
This is a topic that Blitzy is very passionate
I
about.
am extremely passionate about this. I have not played a normal race in. Okay, I played one normal race. I played a gnome, and that was
Mhm.
in Jamie's
Yeah,
campaign, and that was
yeah,
because he didn't want weird things. And I
yes,
am known for weird things because I
yeah.
am the person who, in Nisha's campaign, decided to play a feral griffin.
So we should bring up at the beginning
Yes,
that race is a very complex topic. It's got lots of real world implications, and it's very big in the blogosphere right now for obvious reasons.
obvious reasons, as it should be. But in this case,
Yep.
we are talking race as a species and
Yeah,
not
we're talking
race as a
about the
culture.
yeah, we're talking about the background, whatever you want to call it, in D&D, particularly fantasy role-playing games in general. But I mean, as far back as like Tunnels and Trolls, people were trying to get away from the word race because it's used incorrectly. Usually, when they in a role playing game context, when they say race, they mean species.
Yes, we're talking about
Uh,
species. We're talking about,
so,
like humans, gnomes, elves, dwarves,
yep.
the traditional races. I think they're dead. But what are the traditional races? We're talking about elves,
Hmm.
uh, dwarves,
Yes.
humans,
Hmm.
uh, halflings, half elves,
Hmm.
orcs. We're talking about what are considered the Tolkien races. A lot
Yeah.
of these races were created by J.R.R. Tolkien for
Well,
Lord of the
created.
Rings.
They were brought into his legendarium. Yeah. So the long reach of Lord of the Rings on gaming. Um, and funny. It's kind of a weird thing about it because Gygax didn't particularly dig Lord of the Rings. I mean, he enjoyed it, but Dungeons and Dragons is based on pulp, so it's Conan, it's Dying Earth, it's Pellucidar, and in those settings, it's mostly humans, and whatever you would call a something of a race would be like the Serpent People or stuff
Right.
like that, and they were generally evil, monstrous enemies.
Right.
In the 1970s, and Lord of the Rings was huge all over college campuses, and so
Refresh my
uh,
memory. When did Lord of the Rings come out?
well, Lord of the Rings
1960s?
originally came out in the 50s, I think it
50s?
was 50s and 60s.
Yeah,
It came out over a long period.
I need to correct myself because elves, halflings, elves and dwarves are they weren't created by J.R.R. Tolkien.
No, I
They're
mean he
long
got
term
them mostly
mythology, but
from
he brought them into more modern.
yeah,
He brought them into the spotlight, basically.
yeah. Well, elves and dwarves are largely Scandinavian folklore, as are goblins,
Right,
trolls.
right. So
Um,
pretty much everything has been rehashed over time. But
yeah, yeah.
when I say the Tolkien races, I say that these are the races that have been popularized by Tolkien and definitely has become a part of the standard fantasy lore
Hmm. Hmm.
for a lot of settings.
All of the
Orcs.
D&D clone games had them, and
Yes.
then modern computer gaming was basically
World of
D&D put
Warcraft,
on the
basically.
yeah put on a desktop. Yeah,
Yep.
so in early D&D, the elves and dwarves, etc., they were all so much better than humans. Humans had nothing. Humans were the
Right.
baseline,
Right.
and then if you wanted special powers, you had to play one of these funky races, and so to balance them, the races were not allowed to gain levels past a certain space. So, the text would talk about elves having centuries to perfect their archery, except that, elves t- elvish fighters topped out at somewhere around 8th level, and so it's like it didn't match up, but
Right.
yeah. And so as the editions went on, people were like, this is dumb.
We need more
If
than
you want,
this. You need
yeah,
to equalize things out.
yeah, if you want humans to be equal or dominant, then you need to buff up humans so that they're on par
They
with the
need
other
to be
races.
equal or dominant, and in terms
Yeah,
of stats, so people will actually play them.
yeah,
I never did.
yeah, and so the idea that humans are like flexible, humans are the do
Yeah.
everything guys,
Uh,
um, became a thing.
you said
So,
that they
and
are
I
the
think
Doc
that's
Brown of the galaxy.
yeah. Well, that's a thing that's come up recently in various internet threads. There's a long thread on like Tumblr, and I think it's gone around like Reddit and Facebook. The basically posited the idea that like in a Star Trek setting, humans are the crazy ones who do shit that doesn't work or that shouldn't work but
This
does.
shouldn't work.
Yeah, it's like, well, if one warp drive is awesome, let's strap two warp drives together and see what happens. And the Vulcans are all, that's a terrible idea.
Why
And
would
the
you do
Andorians
this?
are, oh no, no, no. And the
And
humans are like, yeah,
and
and
yet
it
it works.
works. Yeah. And I can see that. I can,
I can see this. I can believe it.
yeah. Sir Fox asserts that one of the core traits of humanity versus every other, uh, certainly every other creature on Earth, is, you know, something terrible and scary is on the hill over there. I'm gonna go hug it.
Let's go
Right?
find out what it is.
Yes, humans bond with everything. Humans
Yes.
bond with their toasters. You have googly eyes on your
I
Roomba.
have bonded with my Roomba. Those are the traditional races, but in D&D there's also a lot more non-traditional races, and they have changed over the years. But in 5e, the non-traditional races that we have in just in Wizards of the Coast material, we have
Yeah,
tabaxi,
Volos and Xanathars and a
yeah,
couple others.
and in the PHB as well. Like we have tabaxi, where everyone who just wants to be a cat person.
Yeah, I
I
kind of regret. I kind of regret that I'm not playing a Tabaxi in
You could have. You could
Plotlines
have.
game, but I could have, but it wouldn't work
Why
for
have
the
I?
concept I was going for.
Shockingly, I have not yet. That will happen someday. There's the Arakakra Kenku who want to play bird people, which our Plotlines campaign, our current campaign that we just came from, I have an Arakakra
Yep.
rogue named Irie. There's the Dragonborn in the PHB, which is everyone who wants to play basically a half dragon.
Yeah.
Half dragons were a big thing in 3.5. You can put the half dragon template pretty much on anything. And now
Yeah.
in 5th edition, you have the Dragonborn, which is
Yeah, well,
default
the
half dragon.
dragon person archetype goes back a lot further than that, and I'm actually surprised that it took until basically 4E was where Dragonborn made uh, their big debut. There were Dragonkin in 2nd edition that were like monstrous villain, as I recall. They were like one of the enemy races of Dragonlance. But as a playable race, my memory is that Dragonborn pretty much show up with 4E, and it's one of those things where it's like I'm kind of surprised it was never there sooner. We had lizard folk, we had
Right.
kobolds. Well, of course there's dragon people. Why wouldn't there be? But it never came up.
Yeah. Well, you brought up
Yeah.
Lizard Folk. Lizard Folk is another one.
Hmm.
In your Burning Coast campaign, Sir Fox plays a Lizard Folk. And we just spent pretty much 3 or 4 sessions dealing with Lizard Folk.
Yep.
Not nice Lizard Folk, but at the same time, that goes back to the whole monsters are evil. That I feel like that's a topic in itself. There's Tiefling, Asimars. Tiefling is in the PHB. Asimars are more common. I believe they were more regular in 3.5.
Well, I mean, they existed. I never saw anyone play one, but they did exist as a thing that you could do. Actually, I don't think I ever saw anybody play tieflings either until recently. They were all over the art in 4E. The
Yeah, and in
tieflings and
5e too.
Dragonborn. Yeah, it was like suddenly every other person's a tiefling. Elves are old hat now. Being half demon is in. Okay,
It's
fine.
edgy, it's the whole punk
Yeah.
vibe.
Yep.
But then you've also got the Monstery Races, Kobold, Gnolls, Goliath, dragons.
Hmm.
Someone always wants to play a dragon.
Yeah.
Centaurs, and I have a note here that D&D Beyond has 1,001 plus homebrew races, including person with a fishbowl for a head.
Theoretically, anything intelligent, somebody might want to play it, right? The original AD&D uh, Dungeon Master's Guide has like a whole column about that person who always wants to play a dragon and how you deal with it. And the advice basically boiled down to, sure, let them play a one-hit die dragon, and have fun. It's always been a thing. There's always been people who want to do the special thing or the weird thing, or and
Basically me.
D&D, yeah, and D&D has a long, proud tradition of homebrewing everything. I mean, it's D&D started as a homebrew set of rules for tabletop war games. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's
Like
just
as I listened, like those are just a sample of just from the base game. Like those are from like Kobolds, Gnolls. Kobolds, I believe there's Gnoll stats, aren't there, in Volos?
I don't know if there are or not, but it would be trivially easy to include them. And Sir Fox played a Knoll in one of my third edition games. So I mean,
Centaurs just came out
yeah,
in the new book, uh,
the Mythic Odysseys.
Mythic Odysseys book.
Yeah.
They have satyrs now in there as well. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of different non-traditional, uncommon monstery races for people to play. But it's like, why do we play them? Like in my case, like I find the traditional races kind of boring, and at one point we got into a really long conversation about this previously, and trying to figure out why. Um,
Mhm.
for me, we brought this up already, but the it's kind of like Tolkien races, or the traditional races are now seen as normal fantasy. They are common. Like they
Mhm.
are. You go into, as we said, every setting that you go into, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy even has elvish sort of
Mhm.
races. I haven't played
I
that
don't
in a
know, but
long
I mean
time.
Spock is an elf.
Spock
So
is basically an elf.
Spock is an elf, yeah.
So it's like you see elves, dwarves, halflings, all of those have been in just generic fantasy all of my life.
Mhm.
At no point has that been a new flavor for me. So,
Mhm.
at least in my case, I feel like it's like, well, yeah, those are all normal. Of
Mhm.
course you can, of course you can go ahead and play those if you wanted to, but look at all these other cool things that you could play. I mean, I play a griffin.
Mhm.
It's like, why not?
There's kind of like two different things at work here. There's part of it is for D&D, especially since it is the big tent game. There has to be room for things that people expect. So that person who just has always wanted to be a halfling can be a halfling, right?
Yeah.
But there's also room for the person who's sick of halflings can be something else, and um, in our particular case, like you and I don't think we have a fundamental disagreement, but this came up in the context of Jamie's game because he wanted people to play the normal fantasy races. And that's where the conflict came from, is because that's like a thing you just don't want.
Right. It's just
Whereas,
it's not a
yeah,
thing that I find interesting.
yeah. So I'm like, I can find something interesting about the normal fantasy races. I agree that they have been around forever and they've kind of gotten played out. For me, it's like if I really wanted my elves to be different, I would make them like Tolkien's elves because D&D elves are not really like Tolkien's elves.
No,
Um,
Tolkien's elves are like D&D elves are kind of like watered down in a way.
yeah.
They're more like Vulcans, or
Mhm.
they're special. Like they're but they're also not fantastic. I guess is the
Yeah,
best way
yeah.
to frame it. They're not
Tolkien's.
fantastical. They're not really glorious. Whereas Tolkien's
Mhm.
elves, they're like, oh my gosh, there's these gorgeous, like,
Well, they're alien
entities. Yeah,
creatures
they're
in a way.
aliens. So
Yeah.
alien. You don't, and you see them so little of them.
Like if you wanted the experience of a Tolkien-esque elf, an actually Tolkien-esque elf in D&D, then you'd have to go with something like an Aasimar or an Eladrin. Something that is more exotic.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, you know, I always want to play a tabaxi. I even uh, in college, like the first fantasy character I made outside of the context of the D&D group I had been playing in high school was for Fantasy Hero. He was a catfolk swordsman. In modern terms, he would be a tabaxi fighter.
Right.
I made him for Fantasy Hero, but we're talking 1987 here, so it's not like
That's
it's
unheard of.
yeah, yeah. So one of the reasons I gravitated towards Fantasy Hero in college was because D&D didn't let you do things like this, right? There was no way to play the catfolk hero in D&D without doing some heavy lifting. And one of the things I like about modern D&D is this idea that if you want something, just toss it in, figure out a way to make it work.
One thing that does come up a lot, and at least in Reddit and in the D&D circles, is that all of the characters that people are making are weirdies. There's these non-humanoids. Everyone is creating parties that are not elves, humans, dwarves. They are tabaxi, tiefling, dragonborn,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
kobolds, and we're seeing more and more of that, especially as people are complaining about it more. So,
Yeah, well, I do think there is a cultural shift going on to some extent. I think that uh, like you say, the ones that have been there for for people where D&D has always existed, the core races have always existed. So, uh, they are wanting to create their own thing, and I think that's a natural process. I think uh, that's part of sort of cultural renewal. Myths get recycled, stories get recycled, people bring their own stuff to it. And I'm like just in the past 2 years, 3 years maybe, I've watched kobolds in the popular culture, right?
yes, kobolds have become
They
very popular. It's very strange.
Yeah, they've gone from being these sort of annoying little lizards to being everybody's, gremlin mascot, to being these scrappy little can-do steampunk heroes, to suddenly being like adorable. Like over the past year, the adorable kobold has become a thing,
Yep.
you know?
I mean, I'm not going to deny it. My kobold in the Burning Coast is kind of adorable.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, if you look at kobolds, the whole dog person kobold thing is purely a D&D invention. That came straight out of the Holmes Basic D&D
Mhm.
booklet. The word kobold just it means cobalt. I mean the mineral cobalt, and it goes back to mining spirits that were effectively goblins in the mythology, right?
Mhm.
So the kobolds as we know them, the little diminutive lizard folk, kinda sort of with dog-shaped snouts. That is purely D&D, but it has become this whole cultural thing. And like I say, it's morphed over the past year, so it's something that like if I brought forward a time traveler from like the year 2005 2010 and showed them this is what kobolds are like now, they'd be like,
No,
what
that's not what
what
kobolds are.
happened?
How did this
What
happen?
happened? Yeah. So I think
What
this
happened
is
to
a natural
Tucker's
process.
kobolds? They're no longer annoying. They're adorable.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a normal sort of cultural process that goes on. I'm always leery of throwing away the old to make room for the new. I like seeing them integrate, right? So, you know, I like that the traditional races are there and around
Hmm.
and like are a tool in my narrative toolbox. I think the complaints about everybody's playing a weirdie, some of that comes from the 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 deliberate anthropocentrism of early D&D. Like I said, they were based on the old pulp stories, which they were set in a the pulp stories were typically set either in a far-flung post-apocalyptic future or a mythological prehistorical past on Earth,
Hmm.
right? So humans were it, um, with a few exceptions. So that created the sort of norm that people are expecting when they're looking at these fantasy stories. The expectation of what fantasy would look like, and if you look at like OSR materials and
Hmm.
stuff, especially the ones that were trying to be like the old days of D&D, they very much are like humans, 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 humans.
Yeah,
That's what they're about. So the people who are complaining that everybody's a weirdie, they're complaining because they expect this. They expect their D&D to look like these old fantasy stories,
but they don't
right?
anymore. They're people are not coming in with the grizzled old
Yeah,
human. They're not coming in with the chipper little halfling. They're coming in with
yeah,
the catfolk and the chipper, uh, bright-eyed kobold.
yeah. Well, and that's the thing is fantasy is about making up whatever appeals to you. Fantasy is about being able to be different from the world outside your door. So, you
And
know, the fact that it doesn't look like these stories from almost a century ago, in my view, is not a bug. It's a feature.
gamers, we typically identify as outsiders. So maybe there's some uh, wanting to actually identify with an outsider within the world as well. That
Hmm.
sort of draws us to the more unusual races as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that is a thing where part of the problem is not that there is a weirdie in the group, but that everybody is a weirdie. That's when it's like, you know,
Kind
Jamie.
of loses its shine, kind of loses
Yeah,
its luster a bit.
yeah. I mean, Jamie's complaint about having a group of all weirdies is that he becomes distracted of like, well, where do these people fit in my world? Where do they come from, etc. You could swap anything. You could say there are no gnomes in my world, but tabaxi are normal,
Right.
for instance, right? And in that case, if you were playing a tabaxi, you suddenly wouldn't be a weirdie. He would
Right.
just be the different option.
And then the gnomes would be
And
the
then,
weird ones.
yeah, and Jamie actually used that in the game that where you played the gnome.
Right.
The premise of that world was that there were elves and orcs. Those were the natives
There
of
are
the
no
world.
gnomes. There are no dwarves.
Yep. And because he wanted to make here's a weirdy option that he was comfortable with, he said there's this one pocket of humans who are transplanted from another world through a portal. So humans are the weirdos. And Surfy, who loves to play the weirdo, was like, "Okay, I'm going to be a human gunslinger." And Jamie was like, "Yes, okay, you be that weird thing, a human gunslinger."
I
Yep,
can work with
that's
that.
weird.
He can work with
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And and they were both happy. Surfy got to be the oddball. Jamie got to have nothing that was really that odd,
Right.
you know.
And we've talked about this before, and I do understand that. Like, there's definitely a feel. You've you've gotten written here. If everyone is the Chewbacca, then who's the human?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is if you look at fantasy literature or whatever, there's always a weirdo. There's always a
Yes.
Chewbacca, there's always a Groot.
Yes.
There's always,
But everyone else is
the one
typically
character.
normal.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So when you have a group that's made up of Rocket, Groot, Chewbacca, um, Ukla the Mock, the oddball from every other world, and no
and add a
normal
Hulk
person.
just because.
Yeah, Hulk is a great one. You know. So then you've got, well, who's a human? And sometimes that's a great premise. Like C.J. Chera's Pride of Shunur series is based on the premise that there's all these cat aliens, and they find a human somewhere, and they don't know what to do with him. And the whole series is about them reacting to having this weirdo human in their group. If you're in a situation like that, you kind of have to make the story about that,
Right.
which lots of DMs don't want to tell that story. They want to be doing something else. So
It's a different way to really do a setting. Like we are used to all humans. Like we
yeah,
physically we are in a human setting, human centered
yes,
setting. This is what we
yes,
know, and it's easiest for us to create worlds that are still focused on humanoids, human uh,
yeah,
characters, human races, and
yeah. I mean, elf is in D&D. Elf is basically human with a couple of little tweaks, and dwarf is basically human with a couple of little tweaks, and even the tieflings and the Aasimar, they've got slightly different colorings, but they look like humans. They act like humans.
typically
They
what people do is like they they take from different human civilizations to create their the dwarves, their elves. Like dwarves are usually Scottish,
yeah,
and they take
yeah.
Scottish or Irish accents and flavorings. Um,
Hmm. So, but I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to go down. Is all those stereotypes. But if you want to have weirdy races be normal, is you create a world that kind of ends up looking like Disneyland, right? Where uh, you've got you've got humans and elves and tabaxi and Aarakocra and stuff all sort of mixed together, and you open up a door to a tavern, and you could see 10 different races of people just hanging out,
right,
right? Um, and that's a very flavorful setting. It's like walking into the Mos Eisley Cantina. It's weird and exotic and cool, but it has logical problems. Like
right.
like how is there sufficient population in any given fantasy city for all these species to like reproduce without having like interbreeding problems? Just for starter, like if
Well, I mean
if there's
that's an
a
interesting.
halfling,
That's definitely an interesting way to have an issue, or
yeah,
definitely an interesting issue to have. In my
yeah,
case, Everkeep is a little bit in that way. I don't
hmm,
emphasize it as much because the emphasis is on the party.
yeah,
Um, but Everkeep takes part in a port city
hmm,
that is basically the port of call for this entire section of the ocean. So
hmm,
it's not that there are all these different races that live in this area, though there
hmm,
is a beastmen sort of area nearby.
yeah.
Um,
It's like the
it's
crossroads.
like crossroads. So
Yeah.
these aren't creatures that live there. They come through there. They're doing, uh, they're purchasing, selling. They're looking
Hmm,
for work, and then they're going on.
hmm,
So that
yeah.
at least is how I manage it in my campaign.
Yeah, and that's for the purposes of any given fantasy city, that's a thing that makes sense. But I'm looking at on like on a world level.
Right.
Um, you know, in the real world, Homo sapiens wiped out all the other
Right.
proto-humans that were competing for
Long
resources
time
using the
ago.
same. Yeah, yeah, and so it's like what is preventing that from happening in your fantasy world? Like, why haven't the tabaxi eaten all the Aarakocra? Why, or just to pick something,
That's fair.
typical, or
I mean, that's perfectly fair.
yeah, or I mean, for that matter, being airborne is such an advantage. Why haven't the Aarakocra dominated all the other races by just being able to rain spears down on them, right? So this is a logical problem with sort of the Disneyland world of how's it ended up that way, how's it stuck that way, and D&D already sort of has that problem of why are there goblins in that cave and kobolds in that cave and bugbears over there, and it's just on some level you just sort of don't think about it, but it is a thing where the more races you add,
The
the
more
more
complicated it
noticeable
gets.
it becomes. Yeah, Star Wars is a setting with a bazillion different worlds,
Right.
so you know there's places for all these different species to exist and thrive and have their own ecosystem, and blah 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 blah.
I feel like a lot of the way that D&D does this by default is through different planes. Like the Aarakocra, in their write-up, they come from the plane of air.
Yeah, the Aarakocra are specifically extraplanar
So
origin, yes.
I feel like that's a big part of it. And tabaxi, they're nomads.
They're always from far away.
They're always
wherever
from
your
far away.
campaign
They're
is
nomads.
set.
They're
Yeah.
far away. They're
Yeah.
from wherever you aren't.
Yes.
So at
Yeah.
least in this case, that's how D&D is managing it. They're either extraplanar or they're on the other side of the world, and that's. But yeah, I do get what you're talking about now. It's like how do they all mesh?
Yeah. If you don't have a setting like that, if you do have a setting where the races are weird and your player characters all just happen to be weirdos, like you came together in this port town where everybody from anywhere in the world could appear, and then your party goes wandering off to the Shire to have an adventure, right? Every tavern you walk into, the wow, you are all so weird is a thing that you just have to do over and over and over and over again. That could get very tiresome, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that, especially in your campaign in Storm King's Thunder. It's like,
Yeah.
this is just random griffin. What is this?
Yeah, well, in Storm King's Thunder, the group had a griffin. For a while, you guys had a storm giant.
Yeah, we
What else?
had looks. We
Yeah.
have a squirrel folk. Everyone
the
else
squirrel
was
folk,
everyone else is normal. It was the griffin and squirrel folk that stood out, but we had elves and humans.
Yeah.
Um,
And I didn't mind playing that up from time to time, but it was also a thing where I felt like every time you went to a new place, I had to have somebody mention it because it wouldn't make sense for them not to, based on the world as it had been presented.
yes,
You know.
definitely.
The other thing about the party of weirdies is you start looking at game balance issues.
Yes, the different races all have different abilities that you're not really seeing in the original, player's handbook.
Or
Flight.
at least not very much of.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, flight is a huge one actually. That was something in my Storm King's Thunder game that I really had to account for early on. Is that not everybody, but two of the 5-6 characters could fly at will. Nicky's gliding, combined with his ability to super climb everywhere because he was a squirrel,
it was basically
not
flight.
quite flight, but it was close enough.
It was close enough.
Right. There was never an issue where Swiftstorm and Nicky couldn't get where they wanted to be.
Right.
If there was a pit, they'd go
You
over
just fly
it.
across, and Swiftstorm was big enough to carry someone across, back and forth. So,
Yeah. So on the one hand, at low levels, that took away a lot of potential issues. I couldn't put you in front of a gorge and say, "Haha, how are you? How are you second and third level characters going to get across that?" On the other hand,
fly up.
yeah. On the other hand, it did make later that when you guys had an airship, right, that I could have airship battles where dragons were attacking and you guys went out to engage, was a thing that was possible. You weren't just sitting ducks getting pelted by the dragon.
It kind of makes DM stretch their brain a bit because you aren't using the typical D&D traps. You aren't using the typical obstacles that you would in the first place. It forces you to basically come up with new ways to do things. And I feel like that's a good idea. That's a good thing to typically have. A lot of people don't like it, and that's why a lot of DMs, restrict against Aarakocra because they can fly.
Yeah, but I mean, wizards can fly starting at 5th level, I think it is.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it is something where eventually you will have to deal with it.
And everyone can see in the dark.
Yeah.
Everyone has dark vision.
And the main thing you have to do really is sort of figure out is like learn the rules around seeing and falling and whatever else beforehand, so that when this stuff pops up, you can figure out how to work with it. Okay, well, this is why I'm positing it to you, since your assertion is that the old races are meh. What I'm sending you as a challenge. What would you do to make them cool?
I think that to make the old races more interesting would be to make them more interesting. Don't use instead of using the old, well, elves are higher up above us. They are beautiful and gorgeous. Switch it up. Our elves like are they godlike instead of just these gorgeous humans? Are they maybe there's in some cases like different flavored elves. Um, like there are wolf elves, I think, in some case where they're more wild and
The
bestial.
ElfQuest ones were basically elf barbarians. Yeah.
Yeah, they're more bestial creatures.
Hmm.
Um, to switch it up.
Well, I mean, if you look at like Eberron, that was part of what they were trying to do with Eberron was do something new with everybody. So like they made the halflings, these uh, dragon riders or dinosaur riders,
That is
and
interesting. I didn't.
yeah,
I have not actually seen that in the book. I didn't read that far in.
yeah, and elves. It's been a long time since I was steeped in the Eberron lore, so I've forgotten some of it. But I have this idea that elves are like ruled by a council of liches, things like this. So they made a point of weirding up the races. What I think of when I think of the Eberron elves is I'm sort of like, or the Eberron halflings. I mean, is when I want to play a halfling, it's because I want to play Bilbo or I want to play Frodo. Like if they don't have hairy toes, what's the point of having a halfling at all, right?
If
They're
they're not
just
cheerful and talking about their entire family history, what's the point of being
yeah.
halfling?
That's
Like,
if I want that archetype, and if that archetype is not being used, then I'm sort of like
well, why use it?
halflings are superfluous. But I mean, the thing of that is that reduces the entire race to a single stereotype, which
Right.
is, historically not cool. But it's also,
It's a
so
little
how
tiring
do
as
you?
well. Like this is part of the point of saying that the old races are meh. It's like
Yeah.
we've dealt with a stereotype this entire time, and the stereotype is kind of old hat. And also, we should be
Hmm.
getting away from stereotypes in the first place because they're terrible.
Yeah. So I think another possibility would be to like lean into whatever's boring. So like if you think elves are old and tired, maybe just to be weird, play an all elf campaign and have challenge everybody to come up with an interesting elf character and see the different ways you could take that. Might end up with something that looks like the Silmarillion, where the elves are very different from D&D elves. You've got the kinslaying, and you've got these mighty oaths, and you know elves doing horrible things to each other. You got this elvish Game of Thrones going on,
Right.
which is not something in a traditional D&D game that you might expect to see. The elves in traditional D&D are usually, the good guys.
Right.
But as long as individuals have free will, some people are going to be good guys, some people are going to be bad guys, etc. And I think some of like the lore around Lolth and the Drow is trying to like lean into that.
Hmm.
You know, especially as has been sort of retooled for 5e. Of having it be a little less black and white than of you know Lolth is evil, and so all of her followers are evil, etc. There's this kind of Lolth was betrayed and is hurt and angry, and her followers are they're kind of stuck in this bad situation kind of vibe. That's a lot more interesting. I think if you like really delved into it, you could do a lot of cool stuff with it.
I feel like in that sort of sense, like if you have an all elves or all humans, it does force people to lean more into what the character actually is instead of focusing on so much being the weirdie or having
Mm-hmm.
these weird traits. What can you do with just an average person with their personality, their background, and you make the person interesting as opposed to the race being interesting.
And I think really that's at the in the final analysis, that's got to be true of any character you make,
Yes.
right? Um,
You
Shade
can't.
of the Candle, Shade of the Candle is not cool because she's a tabaxi. She's cool because she's this, you know, angry pirate girl who's been raised in the sewers and wants to make something of herself. I could see a human version of Shade of the Candle being an interesting character.
Right.
Um, the fact that she's also a tabaxi is a very big bonus for me, but it's not what makes Shady interesting. And I think you know any kind of a weirdo character that you play has to have a an interesting character at their core. It's like Tony Stark talking to Spider-Man. If you're nothing without the suit, you don't deserve the suit. If you're nothing without your witty race, you don't deserve your witty race. All
All
right.
right.
So looking at next week. So as always, we like to get input from our viewers about what we choose.
Please.
So the topics we're looking at potentially for next week, unless you guys send us something else you want us to talk about.
Please send us
Uh,
something.
yeah. So there is your Game Master Credo, which is a basically it's like, what is your philosophy of game mastering, right? What have, what are your goals
How
in
do you
being a
want?
game
How do
master?
you DM in terms of
Yes. How and why?
how and why?
Yeah, etc.
Well,
And that's a concept I stole from the Angry GM, but I love it and I think it's very valuable.
that's an
So,
interesting thing to think about because every GM does have their own credo and definitely their own reasons for DMing and how they
mhm.
bring their own personality to the DM to
Yeah,
the
and I
game.
think a lot of DMs haven't really thought about it. They have this sort of unwritten credo, and it's like, well, think of it, figure out, and be more deliberate with it.
Also, respect at the table. Like, how do you respect not just yourself and your characters, but how do you respect the other players? How do you respect the DM? Like, are you rolling dice when you shouldn't be? Are you giving advice when people don't really want it? Or not just your players, but your DM,
Hmm. Hmm.
the game. How do you respect the game? And what
Yeah.
you can do to improve that respect or be more respectful.
Hmm.
That's the term I'm looking for.
Yeah. So, and the other one we've thought of so far is reskinning. We've mentioned it a few times.
It's always fun.
Uh, yeah, and I think reskinning and also like customizing characters,
Yes.
like uh, going back to Shade of the Candle. She's going to take some levels in Bard, but she's got no business being a spellcaster. So I want to reskin all of her spells as
I am
gadgets.
very interested to see how you take that. But those are our suggestions. Please leave us more.
Yep.
Please, if you have any ideas of anything you want us to talk about, anything that we've mentioned that you want us to go further on, which we
Yeah,
totally
or
can.
anything. Yeah, or anything that's just like bothering you in your own game that you would like us to you know
Yeah.
hash out or discuss or give you suggestions on.
You give us a
We
subject and we can probably talk about it for a half hour. Usually.
yeah.
And also, if you have any ideas of things you'd like us to do, because we are bouncing around some other ideas for videos, um,
Hmm.
we're totally open to suggestions.
If you want us to delve deeper into like Roll20 or tools that we use, I'd be happy to talk about that.
We could create small videos for that. If you like us below, subscribe,
Yes.
and click that little bell to notify when
Yeah,
we
those the
make
that
a
will
new
really
post.
help our channel grow and get us help us build a community. And as always, I want to plug my Patreon because that's how I make my living. So there's gonna be a link down below, but it's pretty much patreon.com/the_Gneech. And you'll get access to my artwork and my writing and videos and whatever else that I come up with there. Um, and yeah, so I think we've pretty much covered everything for this week. So thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you for listening,
Yep.
and
And we'll see you next time.
yeah, see you next time.